Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The desert slept beneath a blistered sun, holding its silence like an old secret. Winds drifted along the red ridges and cracked basins of Arizona territory, carrying dust across the land in restless swirls. The country had a way of stripping a man down to his bones, testing the measure of what lived inside him. Yet on that late summer afternoon, the desert carried not only dust, but the smell of something unfinished, something abandoned. The cowboy, known across 3 counties as Colt Braddock, rode alone through the valley, heading toward the mining settlements west of the Superstition Mountains. His horse moved with the tired rhythm of a long trail ride, hooves tapping against the packed earth. Colt had been many things in his years: ranch hand, cattle scout, bounty tracker, when circumstances demanded it. But above all, he carried a reputation for a certain relentless stubbornness. Trouble didn't scare him, cruelty disgusted him, and injustice, no matter how common on the frontier, always rubbed him raw. The land around him was quiet except for the cry of a distant hawk circling the sky. He felt the stillness in his chest, the kind that often preceded bad discoveries. There was a trail ahead, one barely visible except for cart tracks almost erased by shifting sand. Colt nudged his horse toward it, letting instinct guide him. As he rode further, a shape appeared up the trail. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a broken wagon left to rot under the sun. But the closer he came, the more obvious it became that the thing was too small to be a wagon, and someone lay atop it. A wooden handcart rested at the edge of a dried ravine, the wheels half, buried in grit, as though they had been abandoned in a hurry. A frayed rope hung loosely from its handle, faded cloth draped over what first looked like bundles of supplies. Colt's horse slowed on its own, sensing the tension in its rider. The figure on the cart was a woman. Her body lay still, twisted slightly to one side, as though placed there without care. Long black hair, tangled in dust, streaked, spilled over the rough planks of the cart. Her clothing, simple, worn buckskin, marked her as Apache. More specifically, from the beadwork stitched into the collar, she belonged to one of the mountain bands known for fierce independence. Her arms lay against her sides, rigid and unmoving. The earth around the cart showed tracks, many of them, boots, horses, and what seemed like drag marks. The scene told the story without words. A group had come through, carrying her on the handcart, then simply left her to whatever fate the desert chose. Colt's gut tightened. Abandoning any human being in this country was as good as sentencing them. Abandoning a paralyzed woman unable to defend herself, unable even to crawl for shelter, was something far worse. It was the kind of cruelty he had only seen committed by men who believed the sun itself bowed to them. He dismounted and stepped closer. Heat pressed against him in waves, and the air tasted of dust and iron. The woman's breathing was shallow, so faint it barely stirred her chest. Her legs lay motionless, and from the stiffness of her posture, he could tell she could not feel or move the lower half of her body. The cords of her wrists bore marks where she had been tied recently and tightly. Whoever brought her here had not intended mercy. The world around him vibrated with the muted hum of the desert buzzing flies, the wind dragging sand, the echo of distant rockfalls. Even in such noise, the woman's stillness screamed louder. The sun continued to beat down, the sky a pitiless vault of light. No water, no shade, no tracks of anyone returning. Whoever left her had done so deliberately and without remorse. Colt lifted his gaze to the horizon, imagining the type of men capable of it. He had crossed paths with many men who hated the Apache ranchers angry about cattle raids, prospectors scared of night shadows, soldiers who believed all tribes were enemies of the Union. Men like that justified anything. The desert had become their dumping ground. The longer he stared, the heavier the truth pressed upon him. If he rode on, she would die before evening. The vultures circling the distant ridge already knew it. Colt removed his hat and wiped sweat from his brow. One part of him whispered the hard logic of frontier survival. He had his own destination. He had business to resolve. He had miles to ride before sundown. Taking responsibility for someone in such condition meant changing everything time he didn't have, dangers he didn't need, and trouble he hadn't invited. But the sight of her, broken, abandoned, treated as less than human, burned something deep inside him. The desert did not care what happened here, but Colt Braddock cared. He knelt beside the cart. Her face was sunburned, her lips cracked, but there was a strength in her features, a fierce dignity that even suffering couldn't erase. Whatever had happened to her, she had fought until the world forced her still. Colt studied the tracks once more. They led east toward the old cattle passes that outlaw riders often used to cross into Apache territory. A heavy group, maybe 6 or more men, had hauled her this way. Why they had taken her, and why they had abandoned her, remained a mystery. But the cruelty of leaving her here told him enough about the kind of men he might be dealing with if he dug deeper. The sun inched downward, stretching shadows across the sand. Colt understood the weight of the decision before him. If he chose to take her, he was involving himself in something dangerous. The desert didn't simply allow stories like this to unfold without consequence. Men who abandoned a helpless woman did not do so casually. They did it because they had something to hide, or someone chasing them. The bird circling overhead let out a hungry cry. Colt's jaw tightened. Turning away wasn't an option anymore. He glanced around the valley, checking for movement. The country felt too quiet, as if eyes watched from the broken ridges and thorned brush. The Apache often moved like shadows, unseen until they chose to be seen. If this woman belonged to a local band, her people might already know what happened, or they might assume she had been taken far away, leaving them searching in the wrong direction. Colt's mind worked through every possibility. None of them made what he had to do any easier. The desert wind shifted, lifting strands of the woman's hair. Her breathing hitched, a faint, fragile sound, and Colt realized she was closer to death than he first thought. Every moment he lingered in uncertainty drained another drop of time she could not spare. He reached for his canteen and brought it near her mouth. Even unconscious, her body fought for survival, swallowing what little water touched her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove one thing: she hadn't given up. She had been left here to die, but she had not surrendered to death. The sky above dimmed as the sun lowered behind distant mesas, staining the desert gold and crimson. Shadows stretched across the land like reaching hands. Colt rose to his feet and looked around once more. He could walk away. No one would judge him. No one would ever know. The desert swallowed secrets for a living. But as he rested his hand on the wooden handle of the abandoned cart, he felt a shift inside him, a recognition that some crossroads in life were meant to be taken, no matter the cost. Fate had a way of dropping burdens at a man's feet, not asking whether he wanted them, only whether he was the sort of man who would carry them. Colt had spent his life trying to outrun the ghosts of choices he never made. This time, he refused to ride away. He tightened the straps, secured the woman as best he could, and prepared himself for the long, grueling task ahead. The trail to shelter would be slow. The dangers waiting on the horizon were unknown. But leaving her behind was no longer a thought he could entertain. The desert exhaled, as though acknowledging his decision. Night crept closer, and somewhere beyond the ridges, the men who abandoned her continued on their path where that a cowboy had just chosen to stand between them and the fate they intended. The long journey, and the danger that would reshape Colt's life forever, was only beginning. The first stretch of trail proved far harder than Colt Braddock expected. The wooden handcart, built for short hauls across campgrounds or village paths, protested every inch of the broken desert terrain. Its wheels wobbled against stones, sank into loose sand, and creaked beneath the weight of the paralyzed Apache woman, whose life now depended entirely on a cowboy who had not meant to become anyone's savior that day. Dusk smothered the desert in violet shadows as Colt looped the handcart's rope across his shoulder and began the long, grueling pull toward distant ridgelines where he knew a narrow wash offered shelter from predators and night winds. His horse followed close behind, snorting in discomfort, sensing that the journey ahead would test more than muscle. The air grew colder with the falling sun, though heat still radiated from the ground like breath from a buried furnace. Colt's boots sank with each step, and every few yards he had to lean back, forcing the cart's wheels free from stubborn patches of soft earth. Sweat chilled on his skin, mixing with dust until his entire body felt carved from the landscape itself. Behind him, the woman lay unmoving except for faint, rhythmic breaths. The desert had nearly claimed her, and her body remained fragile, suspended between two worlds. Colt knew that if he pushed her too fast, the strain could break what little strength remained in her. But if he slowed his pace, nightfall would overtake them before shelter could be reached, and the night held its own dangers. Coyotes roamed freely once the sun died, and farther west mountain lions crept from hidden dens in search of water and weakened prey. Even more perilous were the riders who might still be watching from a distance, the same men whose boot tracks marked the ground near the abandoned cart. Men who might return, men who might consider a cowboy helping an Apache woman a threat to be removed. The trail grew steeper as Colt approached the base of the ridge. He planted his feet, leaned forward, and dragged the cart upward, one jerking movement at a time. Muscles burned across his shoulders, and a pulse throbbed behind his eyes. He had hauled freight cattle, downed elk, even a wounded friend once, but nothing compared to the heavy silence of this task. It was more than weight. It was responsibility, the kind that changed the nature of a man. At last he reached the narrow wash carved between layers of sandstone. The walls rose high and cool, painted by centuries of wind erosion. Here, shadows lingered even while the sky remained faintly lit. Colt guided the cart into the hollow, thankful for the stillness and the protective curve of the canyon floor. This would be their refuge for the night. Moonlight began to crawl slowly across the desert above, spilling softer silver over the stones. Inside the wash, it glowed only faintly, allowing the land to settle into a deep quiet. Colt checked the woman again. Her breathing, though faint, held more stability than before. The water he had given her earlier had granted her body a small margin of time. But her clothes were soaked in heat and dust. Her skin showed the harsh marks of long travel and even longer suffering. Colt spread his bedroll beside the cart and set his canteen within reach. He fed his horse and listened to the land's silence, one hand always near his rifle. The wash shielded them from the wind, but it also hid movement well, friend or foe. Above them, the stars brightened and the chill deepened. As he kept watch, Colt's mind drifted back to the abandoned trail where he'd found her. He replayed the marks on the ground, the number of horses, the path they had taken. The boot tracks told a story. A group had traveled fast and light, likely under pursuit. And the cart's wheels had carved deeper grooves farther back, meaning the woman's condition had worsened long before they abandoned her. Something else bothered him. The boots that abandoned the cart belonged to different men than those who originally hauled it. The fresh tracks and the older ones did not match. Some men had taken her, others had left her. That meant conflict. Infighting, a fracture among the group. Perhaps someone had argued about what to do with her. Perhaps someone had tried to keep her alive, only to lose the argument. Perhaps the man who wanted to abandon her won. Colt considered the dangerous possibilities. If there had been a split among the riders, one faction might still be out there searching for her. Another might expect to return and find her dead. Either way, someone would eventually discover that a stranger had interfered. A rustle echoed through the wash, and Colt froze. A shadow moved across the rocks, stopping briefly before sliding deeper into the dark. Not a predator, too controlled, not deer too deliberate. A scout, perhaps, Apache or outlaw. He couldn't be sure. The desert's eyes were always watching, but no attack came, no approach. Just silence again and the cold. Hours later, the woman's breathing changed, faint but steady in a new rhythm. It was the first sign her body was pulling away from death. Colt remained alert, knowing that small victories in survival often came just before new dangers. The night crawled by, and Colt fought exhaustion, shoulders aching, eyelids heavy, every sense stretched thin. Yet he refused to sleep completely. He drifted only in brief, shallow moments, always returning to the stillness with sharpened vigilance. As the earliest hint of dawn touched the canyon walls with pale light, Colt prepared to move again. The wash would shield them through daylight, but they couldn't remain here forever. The desert had no mercy for those who lingered too long in one place. He examined the surrounding ridges. Fresh hooves had passed nearby during the night, far above, near the cliff's rim. Not close enough to threaten, but close enough to prove that he was not alone in these hills. Someone had been tracking, either hunting him or searching for the woman. Colt studied the cart once more. Traveling with it across rugged land would only become harder. Yet leaving the woman behind meant forfeiting everything he had fought for through the night. The decision felt heavier in the rising heat. He reinforced the ropes, tied down the bedroll, and packed his gear with the measured movements of a man accepting a burden he had not chosen, but could not abandon. He lifted the cart's handles once more, bracing for the long miles ahead. The woman remained unconscious, but her pulse held a faint defiance, the same defiance that had kept her alive until he found her. That small pulse carried a message the cowboy understood deeply. She was not done with this world. Above them, the sun rose, painting the canyon's upper rim in blazing gold. The shadows retreated, the heat returned, the desert awakened with a restless hunger. Colt stepped out of the wash and looked to the horizon. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay the men who had left her. Somewhere in those hills lurked the truth behind her paralysis, her abandonment, and the danger they now shared. He gripped the cart's handles and pulled forward. The day had begun, and the hunt, whether he welcomed it or not, had already found him. The next chapter would push Colt deeper into a conflict he could neither outrun nor ignore. The morning sun rose with a merciless clarity, stripping every shadow from the desert floor. The land stretched outward in all directions, open and exposed, leaving Colt Braddock and the paralyzed Apache woman with nowhere to hide. The wooden handcart groaned as Colt dragged it up a slow incline toward the high plateau. Behind him the woman lay still as ever, her breathing nearly silent. her life bound to the fragile cart that had already carried her through too much suffering. The heat returned quickly, clinging to his back and pressing through his clothes with rising intensity. Colt felt each degree sharpen the weight of the cart, but he leaned into it, knowing the ridgeline ahead would give him the advantage of higher ground. The desert was unforgiving, but it spoke clearly to those who had learned how to read its tracks, and Colt had always been a man who studied every sign the land revealed. As he climbed the slope, the morning breeze shifted. It carried with it the faint smell of horse sweat, not his horse, and not from the night before. Fresh, sharp, it drifted from the north, where a long stretch of cracked earth cut between two low mesas. Colt paused, drew in another breath, and looked out across the open expanse. There, etched in the powdery soil, were new tracks. A small group of riders had passed no more than an hour earlier. The prints were deep, their cadence steady, their stride disciplined. Whoever rode through had experience and purpose. This was no wandering posse or drifting cattle crew. This was a group on a mission, and their trail aimed directly toward the path Colt intended to take. He tightened his grip on the handles of the handcart. The riders knew this country well, and the direction of their travel suggested they were not avoiding the region. They were searching it. Colt knew then that the abandoned Apache woman was not simply a casualty of cruelty. She was part of something larger, something that had already begun to circle back toward them. He pressed forward again, pace steady, keeping his eyes on the ground for every detail. His boots crunched over the sand, and every few steps he glanced behind him, checking the horizon for any moving silhouettes. His horse followed close, ears twitching nervously. The sun climbed higher. Sweat rolled down Colt's neck and soaked the collar of his shirt. The cart hit a patch of uneven rock, and the jolt rattled the woman's body. Her arm shifted slightly, a small movement, but one that carried a spark of life. Colt watched her chest rise and fall, hoping the rhythm held. He reached the plateau at last, where the land flattened and opened into a long stretch of dry grass and brittle shrubs. Heat waves shimmered off the ground, blurring the horizon until the world appeared to sway. From here he had a view of the entire valley behind them, and what he saw filled his chest with a heavy certainty. 3 distant riders moved steadily across the lower basin. Their silhouettes rose and fell with the terrain, slow but deliberate. They were following the tracks left by Colt's cart and horse, tracing the same path he had pulled himself along since dawn. They were tracking him, and they were gaining. Colt steadied his breathing. He had known this moment would come. Men who abandoned a paralyzed woman did not simply vanish. They circled back to ensure no loose ends survived. And yet someone else, those who had originally taken her, might still be out there as well, unknown and unseen. The danger was no longer a distant speculation. It was closing fast. He moved again, guiding the cart toward a natural break in the plateau, where the ground sloped downward into a narrow gorge. The route would offer some concealment, but it would also slow his pace. Still, the sun's position told him he had only a few hours before the riders reached the base of the ridge. He needed distance, cover, and time, none of which the desert gave easily. The gorge opened before him, its earth carved by centuries of flash floods and shifting storms. Its walls were steep but passable. Colt maneuvered the cart carefully, lowering it inch by inch, letting gravity work without losing control. Loose stones tumbled beside him, clattering against the canyon floor below. His boots slid, but he kept his balance, using the rope strapped across his chest as a brake. Finally, he reached the bottom. The gorge stretched far to the west, twisting like a spine through the land. Colt knew this kind of terrain dangerous to cross. but even more dangerous for those attempting to follow. The riders above would lose sight of him once he entered the deeper bends. The woman breathed softly, her face pale in the filtered light. Colt adjusted her position, shielding her from the direct sun that cut through a crack in the canyon roof. He left his canteen within reach and pressed onward, but the deeper he traveled, the more uneasy he became. The walls around him began to reveal signs of old habitation petroglyphs, carved into stone by Apache hands generations before. The drawings depicted warriors, hunts, and migrations across the land. This gorge belonged to her people, and Colt felt as though they were walking through a chapter of her history. Farther ahead, the gorge widened. The ground here showed another set of tracks, not from riders, but from a single horse pulling a heavier load. The prints were older than the ones he had seen earlier, but not by much. They belonged to the earlier group, the men who had taken the Apache woman in the first place. The trail diverged at a fork in the canyon, one path veering north, the other west. Colt examined the dust carefully. The tracks heading north were fresher, meaning the original captors had not traveled far. This realization deepened the knot in his stomach. Both groups, the ones who abandoned her and the ones who had taken her, were moving within the same region. And now Colt walked directly into the convergence of two dangerous trails. The gorge eventually leveled out, leading into a sheltered basin filled with mesquite trees and the dry remains of an old seasonal creek. The terrain offered better shade but worse visibility. It also offered a place to stop briefly before aiming for the next ridge. He set the cart beside a cluster of tall brush and listened. The wind carried a tension he recognized. Something was wrong. A moment later, a distant echo drifted from the gorge, the unmistakable drumming of hooves against stone. The riders from earlier had reached the plateau's edge. They were descending fast, searching the very path Colt had taken. He scanned the basin for options. The trees offered some cover, but not enough. The creek bed ran deeper farther west, a dry channel that could hide the cart for a short distance. But the journey would be slow, and the riders had already closed the gap. Colt steadied his breathing and pulled the cart toward the creek bed. The woman shifted again, this time with a faint sound of breath strained by the movement. She was alive, but fragile, caught in a storm she never chose. The creek bed narrowed as it wound through the brush, giving Colt a few precious minutes of concealment. But the riders were growing louder. Their hooves struck the canyon floor like distant thunder, each rhythm carrying the promise of violence. Colt moved faster, though every step threatened to twist the cart's fragile wheels. Sweat streamed into his eyes. Dust caked his throat. The horse behind him pulled at its reins nervously. He reached a bend in the creek where the earth rose into a natural wall. Above it, a small ledge extended outward, enough space to hide, but only if he acted quickly. He dragged the cart toward the rock face, searching for footing. The riders were close now, too close. He built what little cover he could, using brush and loose stones to mask the cart's presence. His horse pressed against the wall, muscles tight. The woman lay silent beneath the cracked shadows of the ledge. The hooves grew louder, closer. The riders were about to enter the basin. Colt knew he had only seconds left before the truth stepped into view. The moment that would decide both their fates was about to begin. The riders entered the basin like wolves slipping into a den, slow, careful, and certain that something was waiting for them. Their horses' hooves pressed deep into the dry soil, leaving fresh prints among the older marks scattered across the land. Colt Braddock, hidden beneath the ledge with the paralyzed Apache woman on her wooden handcart, listened to the distant rhythm of each step. Every breath he took felt too loud, every heartbeat too heavy. The desert seemed to hold its wind, as though the entire basin suspended itself in anticipation. From his hiding place, Colt saw 3 silhouettes pass through the narrow entry of the gorge. They rode in a measured formation, scanning the brush and the creek bed with the tense posture of seasoned hunters. The type of men who left no trail unchecked and no witness alive. Their horses snorted and pawed the ground, sensing the hidden tension hanging in the air. The riders leaned forward, scanning the terrain with eyes that had seen blood before. The basin held its silence with deceptive softness, broken only by the shuffling of hooves and the creak of saddle leather. These men were no casual pursuers. Their discipline, their methodical movements, and the sharpness of their vigilance marked them as a group used to working outside the law. Men who followed their leader with unquestioned loyalty and without mercy. Colt knew at once that they were the ones who abandoned the Apache woman. Their tracks matched the fresher prints he had seen earlier, harsh, uncaring, purposeful. The riders slowed as they reached the center of the basin. They studied the ground carefully. The tracks Colt left leading into the creek bed were visible, though partially obscured by the shifting breeze and the brush he had placed. But traces remained, a dragged line from the cart, a hoof print from his horse, a scuff from his boot. The desert always remembered, even when he wished it wouldn't. The leader of the riders dismounted, crouching low to the ground as he examined the earth. His gloved hand brushed over the faint impressions. His head lifted slightly, lifting toward the creek's bend, toward Colt's hiding place. The man's awareness tightened like a wire pulled taut. Colt's muscles tensed as he remained absolutely still. The Apache woman lay behind him, barely breathing. He positioned himself protectively in front of her, ready to shield her from whatever fate approached next. The basin felt smaller by the second, as though the walls themselves closed inward. The riders fanned out slowly. One took the eastern brush line, another circled to the western side, their horses moving with predatory precision. The leader stayed near the center, eyes following the faint trail that led toward the concealed creek bed. Colt watched every motion, calculating distances, estimating how soon they might discover him. He had lived through ambushes before outlaw camps, cattle raids, border conflicts, but never while protecting someone this vulnerable. The woman's stillness reminded him that he was not fighting for his own survival alone. Her life, already hanging by a thread, depended entirely on the choices he made in the next few moments. The leader stood and motioned subtly to his men. The 2 riders adjusted positions, shifting closer. Their horses tossed their heads nervously as the scent of unfamiliar presence drifted toward them. A sudden gust of wind cut through the basin, stirring the dry leaves of the mesquite trees. It scattered dust against the rocky slope and tugged loose strands of Colt's hair. The air shifted just enough to reveal the faint scent of his horse to the approaching riders. One of the men froze, head lifting sharply. Colt braced himself for discovery, but before the rider could investigate further, another sound broke the fragile stillness. Far from the basin, echoing from the high cliffs beyond, came the unmistakable rhythm of more hooves. Many more. The riders stiffened, instincts sharpening instantly. Another group was approaching, another set of hunters. Another line of danger. Colt knew at once that these were not the same men. The cadence was different, faster, more numerous, and purposeful in a way that held no similarity to the 3 in the basin. These new riders carried urgency, and the land itself vibrated with the weight of their arrival. The 3 outlaws exchanged a silent understanding. They mounted quickly, scanning the ridge. The wind carried the growing thunder of approaching horses. The outlaw leader hesitated for only a heartbeat, before turning his horse toward the northern exit of the basin. They moved swiftly, abandoning their search for Colt temporarily to avoid direct confrontation with whoever was descending upon the region. The moment they disappeared into the gorge, Colt felt tension loosen from his chest, but the relief was only partial. The danger had not passed. It had multiplied. He remained hidden until the sound of the three riders faded into the distance. Then he stepped cautiously from the ledge, scanning the basin for any signs of return. The new group of riders had not yet arrived in sight, but the thunder of hooves drew closer by the minute, rolling across the desert like an incoming storm. Colt repositioned the handcart quickly, checking the Apache woman. Her breathing was shallow, but not weaker than before. He adjusted her coverings, shielding her from the direct glare of the rising sun. Though she remained unconscious, her strength continued to flicker faintly, a fragile flame refusing to be extinguished. The creek bed that had concealed them now threatened to trap them. Colts knew they needed higher ground immediately. He pulled the cart out of the concealment of the ledge, muscles burning from lack of rest and the relentless weight of his task. His horse followed, ears flicking nervously toward the echoes of the approaching riders. The new hooves grew louder, their shadows stretching across the land before the riders themselves came into view. At the top of the canyon's far ridge emerged a formation of mounted warriors, Apache riders, moving with unity and purpose. Their silhouettes cut sharp lines against the sunlit sky. Their movements carried the unmistakable discipline of tribal scouts and protectors. These were not renegades. These were not outlaws. They moved with the focus of kin tracking kin. Colt understood then that these must be the woman's people. They had traced her captors. They had read the desert, and they had arrived in pursuit of a fate that had already begun to unravel. He knew that hiding from them was impossible. The Apache read the land better than anyone alive. Every track, every scuff, every broken blade of grass would tell them exactly where he had been and where he was going. And they would see a lone cowboy with a woman from their own tribe laid across a rough wooden handcart. The misunderstanding that waited ahead could erupt with deadly force. Colt pulled the cart faster, aiming for the western ridge to avoid direct confrontation. The Apache riders descended swiftly into the gorge, following the path of the outlaws. Their presence filled the basin with an intensity that made the very earth tremble. The canyon seemed to pulse with the weight of converging destinies, outlaws fleeing north, Apache riders pursuing with vengeance, and Colt caught in the silent space between, burdened by a woman who had become the center of a storm neither of them asked for. He quickened his pace, pulling the cart out of the basin just as the last of the Apache riders thundered past in pursuit of their enemies. Dust rose in spirals behind them, mocking the urgency of their hunt. Colt exhaled slowly, knowing that their temporary escape only postponed the inevitable. The Apache warriors would eventually circle back. They would find him, and they would demand answers he was not sure he could give. The desert stretched before him in a long, harsh road, an unforgiving trial of choices yet to be made. And the next chapter would bring him face to face with the truth he could no longer outrun. The desert stretched into the afternoon heat with a merciless glare, beating against Colt Braddock's back as he pulled the wooden handcart deeper into the western ridges. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as though the land itself sought to drag him backward into the chaos he had narrowly escaped. Behind him, the paralyzed Apache woman remained unconscious, her breaths shallow but steady, her fragile body bound to the cart that had become both her burden and her lifeline. The Apache riders thundered through the gorge behind him moments earlier, consumed by their hunt for the outlaws who had stolen one of their own. Their passage had shaken the earth and the air, leaving behind a lingering tension that clung to the canyon walls. Colt knew they would eventually return. Apache warriors never left their trails unfinished, never allowed blood debts to fade into silence. But for now, the land was quiet again, too quiet. The desert often fell silent before its worst storms, not storms of weather, but storms of consequence. Colt felt it gathering behind him like a shadow. He continued onward, entering a stretch of wind, carved terrain where the earth rose and fell in long, jagged ridges. Here, the rock walls shielded him briefly from the sun, but the narrow pathways slowed his pace even further. His boots scraped over stone, each sound swallowed quickly by the wheezing breath of the desert. The cart jolted behind him, rattling every time its wheels struck a rut or sharp edge. He paused only when absolutely necessary, adjusting the woman's position to protect her from the shifting sunlight. Her skin had begun to lose its color, drained by exhaustion and the relentless heat. Her paralysis kept her still, but her spirit clung to life with surprising resilience. Every faint breath reminded Colt that he had not dragged her through this cursed land in vain. As he pushed forward, memories of the men who abandoned her resurfaced in his mind. The sharp tracks, the evidence of argument, the conflicting prints that hinted at a group divided by fear, greed, or cruelty. One faction had taken her, another had left her. Both still moved through the region like predators circling wounded prey. Their motives remained a mystery, and Colt knew that understanding their intent was the only way to navigate the danger closing around him. The ridges eventually opened into a wide valley filled with brittle sage and scattered boulders. The sun dipped behind a thin layer of haze, softening the light, but not the heat. Colt stepped into the valley cautiously, scanning for movement. The Apache riders were nowhere in sight. Neither were the outlaws. But on the far side of the valley, faint dust plumes rose from a distant trail. Someone was moving. Colt crouched beside the cart, shielding his eyes against the glare. The plumes rose in a pattern that suggested a small group, likely riding at a steady pace. Too few to be the Apache war party he witnessed earlier, too coordinated to be random travelers. This was a new formation, another thread in the increasingly tangled web surrounding the woman. He watched for several minutes until the riders faded behind a ridge. Their direction aimed neither toward him nor away. It aimed toward a territory known among frontiersmen for hidden springs, rough outlaw camps, and dangerous negotiations. It was a place where fugitives crossed paths, where stolen goods were traded, and where men like those who had stolen the Apache woman might regroup. The realization made Colt's stomach tighten. The outlaws had allies in these lands. If they were heading toward a rendezvous point, they might not escape the Apache pursuit. But if they regrouped before the warriors caught them, they could easily overwhelm anyone who crossed their path, including Colt. He had no intention of crossing theirs, but the desert had a way of pushing men into collisions they did not choose. He turned away from the distant dust trails, pulling the cart toward a cluster of rock formations shaped by centuries of wind. The stones offered shade and a brief respite from the heat. As he guided the cart into the shadows, he glanced at the Apache woman again. Her pulse beat faintly against her neck. Her body remained limp, but her breathing steadied in a slow, fragile rhythm. She had survived longer than anyone who abandoned her expected. Her will to live, despite her injuries, was strong enough to defy the land's cruelty. Colt checked his canteen. The water inside had grown warm, nearly hot, but it was all he had. He poured a small amount near her lips, letting her drink what she could. He knew they would need more soon. There was a spring several miles west, if memory served. but reaching it meant crossing another exposed stretch of desert. He rested only briefly. The safety of the rocks was temporary at best. Once the Apache riders completed their pursuit, they would return to follow every trail that led to their missing woman. Colt had no intention of hiding from them forever, but approaching them while carrying someone they had lost would put him in a dangerous position. They would not know his intentions. They would not know that he found her abandoned, and the Apache rarely gave the benefit of doubt to strangers on their land. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the valley. The distant haze turned copper and gold. Colt guided the handcart out from the rocks and began the next stretch of the journey. As he walked, the valley opened wider, revealing the path to the spring. The land here was quieter, almost deceptively so. The wind hummed through the sagebrush with a low, eerie whisper. Colt watched every horizon. He expected to see riders, either returning Apache or regrouped outlaws, but the valley remained empty. For now, the spring lay nestled between two mounds of red earth. A thin line of green growth marked its location, where grasses struggled up through the dry soil. Colt approached cautiously, aware that animals and men often lingered around rare water sources, but the spring was empty. Only the silent trickle of water from a crack in the stone greeted him. He filled his canteen first, then soaked a cloth and cooled the woman's forehead. Her breathing eased slightly. The water rejuvenated her in a small but meaningful way. As the sun dipped toward evening, the world around them softened. The desert cooled. A gentle, hesitant breeze drifted across the valley. But peace never lasted long in these lands. Colt's horse lifted its head suddenly, ears turned sharply east. The animal sensed what Colt felt next, a faint tremor in the air. A rhythm, not the thunder of a large Apache party, not the slow cadence of wandering travelers. This rhythm struck with the weight of determination. Hooves approaching fast, Colt moved quickly, pulling the cart behind a cluster of low brush. The spring's green patch offered too little concealment, but the terrain here provided limited options. He positioned himself between the approaching sound and the woman, muscles taut, ready for whatever emerged from the ridge. The hooves grew louder. The riders approached the spring with the confidence of men who expected to find something or someone. They crested the ridge, and Colt recognized them immediately. They were the original group, the ones who had taken the Apache woman before the others abandoned her. Their faces were hardened by intent, their horses slick with sweat from relentless travel. And in their formation, he recognized the unmistakable pattern of men who believed they were reclaiming something they had lost. They had found the trail, and they were coming straight for him. The final chapter would decide whether survival, justice, or vengeance claimed the desert that day. The final stretch of the cowboy's journey began under a sky washed clean by the pale colors of dawn. The long night of uncertainty had passed, and with it came the fragile hope that the woman he had pulled from a wooden handcart and from the edge of death might finally reclaim her life. The desert around them no longer looked like the merciless wasteland that had tried to take her. In the buttery morning light, it appeared almost gentle, as though it too had softened toward her fight to survive. The cowboy watched her sleep in the grass hut that the Apache healers had built for her recovery. Her breathing, once shallow and strained, had deepened with every day that passed. Her body had been broken beyond what most people could endure, but her spirit had proved stronger than any wound. He stood outside, feeling the weight of time pressing down on him, not heavy as a burden, but heavy as a realization. He had found a purpose he never expected, and it had arrived disguised as a woman abandoned to die on a forgotten handcart. Inside the hut, the air carried the scent of crushed sage leaves and warm earth. Her legs, once lifeless, no longer lay with the same defeated stillness. They twitched occasionally, small, barely noticeable movements, but signs of life all the same. The healers said the nerves were awakening, reconnecting in slow, stubborn patterns, as though remembering what they had been created for. It had taken weeks of herbs, careful massage, and the unbroken will of everyone around her, but near the end of the second month, she had gained enough control to lift her foot by the width of a leaf. On the day she achieved that miracle, her entire clan had gathered outside the hut and waited in reverent silence. The cowboy, who had carried her through miles of wasteland, felt something inside him unravel, the kind of relief a man doesn't admit he needs. But progress came at its own pace. The days were long, and her body demanded effort that often left her trembling with exhaustion. Still, she refused to surrender. That iron determination the cowboy had sensed on the very first night, when he found her abandoned and still breathing, had only grown stronger. There came a morning when the chief and the healers decided it was time to test her strength beyond the boundaries of her sleeping mat. They prepared the open clearing in the center of the settlement, smoothing the ground so she would not stumble on loose stones. The cowboy sat nearby, leaning on a wooden post, pretending not to worry, but everyone could see the tension in his shoulders. The healers supported her on both sides as they lifted her from the mat, her legs trembling under the sudden burden. She had not stood on her own since the day her attackers left her behind. The cowboy felt a knot in his throat as he watched her straighten, her face tight with pain, but her eyes glowing with determination. She had been broken but not defeated, and now she was fighting her way back toward a life stolen from her. For a long moment the world held its breath, the wind slowed, the desert hushed, even the birds in the tall pines seemed to pause. And then her foot moved forward, not a falter, not a collapse, but a controlled step, then another. She clung to the arms of the healers, but her legs carried her weight. It was the closest thing to a miracle the cowboy had ever witnessed. The clan erupted in quiet but reverent celebration. They did not shout. They honored the moment with soft gratitude, as though a loud noise might break the fragile magic of it. Cowboy looked away, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, hoping no one noticed, but they did. And they smiled. Her recovery stretched into the early weeks of autumn. Leaves turned gold on the edges of the forest, and the nights grew cooler. Every day she walked a little farther, her steps growing stronger. The healers taught her to lean on a carved walking stick until her body no longer needed it. The cowboy walked beside her often, but he always kept a respectful distance, allowing her to rebuild her life with dignity. The day she walked without assistance for a full circle around the camp, the air felt charged with celebration. Even the earth beneath her feet seemed to recognize her triumph. The cowboy stood at the perimeter, watching her move with a strength he had never thought possible. She had been carried, she had been lifted, she had been tended to with patience and care, but now she walked with both legs beneath her, no handcart, no fear, no shame. Her people embraced her, their joy as fierce as the desert sun. And she, standing tall among them, became a living testament to endurance. Where there had once been helplessness, there was now fire. Where there had been fear, there was now pride. Where there had been abandonment, there was now belonging. As the celebrations unfolded, she turned her gaze toward the cowboy, not with dependence, not with gratitude alone, but with the recognition of a bond forged through suffering and survival. He had refused to walk away from her when everyone else had. He had carried her when she could not carry herself, and he had stayed long after duty had finished its work. The chief approached the cowboy later that evening. The wind rustled through the pines as he placed a hand on the cowboy's shoulder, acknowledging what he had done, not with words, but with the solemn respect of a leader honoring a man of integrity. The cowboy nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. He realized then that his time with the Apache might be nearing its end. She had recovered. Her clan had returned to her. Her life was hers again. And as much as his presence had mattered during her healing, he knew that staying forever might place him in a world where he did not truly belong. But the decision weighed heavily on him. The next morning, under the orange glow of sunrise, he prepared his horse, fastening the saddle with slow, deliberate movements. The settlement was quiet, still wrapped in the calm of dawn. He had planned to leave without ceremony, slipping away like a man who never intended to trouble anyone's life. But as he swung his saddlebag over the horse, he sensed someone standing behind him. He turned and found her there. She was walking on her own, steady and strong. No healer supported her. No cane steadied her. She had come to him by her own power, the ultimate expression of everything she had fought for. For a long moment, she simply stood there, the morning light catching the renewed strength in her eyes. She did not need to speak. The cowboy understood. In that silent exchange, she showed him everything gratitude, respect, and something deeper that had grown between them without ever needing words. He knew then that walking away wasn't the right choice. She had not been abandoned twice in her life, and she never would be again. The cowboy lowered his saddlebag, letting it fall gently to the ground, and he stayed,